Hello, hello, hello. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We will start this session, and I'd like to call the participants to occupy the chairs.
I'm going to be speaking for everyone, so you're just going to listen to me.
Don't worry, we are here. Karolinas. Just a minute, please. Don't worry. Okay? Okay, 2 minutes more. Okay, let's start. Thank you very much for the presence here. And this parallel session will discuss MEG events, legislation, and legacy. And we will start with Karolina Tetlak, from assistant professor from the Warsaw University and Faculty of Law. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and accepting this, as I said, emerging issue. I'm a tax lawyer and practitioner, tax academic at Warsaw University, and I started my interest in sports taxation from sportsmen. I research on taxation of sportsmen participating in major sports events. And eventually I came to conclusions regarding the legal and tax framework for sports mega events in general. What I claim is that the legal system created for sports mega events is actually a thing that should be analyzed in terms of legacy of the games. We are very much used to analyzing social legacy of the games, economic legacy, political legacy. We speak about diplomacy in sports, but we still underestimate the issue of sports law and sports legal framework for major sports events. To give you a brief background and overview of how those special tax and legal regimes are implemented. You should know that sports organizations now use very sophisticated and complex legal instruments to actually implement and secure their interests. Basically, the whole procedure starts off with a questionnaire that is sent off to candidate cities, and candidate cities respond to this questionnaire, promising some beneficial, advantageous aspects of the framework for the games. The important thing from the legal perspective is that the bidding phase, already at this stage, is actually underwritten by the government. The government of the candidate city has to provide a set of government guarantees referring inter alia to the legal framework for the games. When the host city is selected, there's a host city contract signed by the local organizing committee and the sports organization, and again the government underwrites this host city contract. What the government promises there is basically to implement legislation that would be necessary or needed to secure the interests of the sports organization. While it is understandable that the existing legal framework in the host city and in the host country might not be sufficient to cover all the issues specific to such a huge event that come up in the meantime regarding, for example, IP protection, intellectual property protection, branding, ambush marketing, and other issues like security, it is still very controversial whether the government should promise special treatment to major sports organizations. And it actually happens because what usually happens in such cases is that the legal framework is not enough, and the legislature has to introduce some special one-off provisions, regulations that actually suspend the existing legal framework. For example, regarding taxation, which is my main area of interest. So normally we should all pay taxes, and all entrepreneurs that earn income in the country that provides the environment for earning income pay taxes. That does not apply to major sports organizations and sportsmen, and lately also to their sponsors. This issue is definitely a hot topic right now in the media. It comes up every now and then. The sports organizations and their official sponsors have been attacked in the media because of the tax promises given by the London 2012 committee and the UK government. But actually there's been no academic and scientific discussion about what it actually means that such legislative interventions are taken. What it actually means from a legal perspective that we introduce event-specific legislation that gives some special treatment to the international sports organization. My idea is that it does create legacy of the Olympic Games, and the fact that we introduce one-off legislation for actually every major sporting event, because it applies to UEFA, to FIFA, and to the IOC, actually creates something that we could analyze in terms of legacy. The question that remains, and I'm also interested in what you think about it, is whether it disintegrates the domestic legal systems or whether it actually advances them. Because the question that we have to ask is, why do sports organizations require those changes in legislation? Is it because the law is ineffective? Is it because it is not modern enough? It's not up to date, given the requirements of such huge undertakings? Or is it that they just require special treatment because they consider themselves above the law? Maybe the legal systems that we have are a little bit outdated. Maybe we should all think about the propositions that sports organizations make and give to advance, to improve legal systems. Or maybe we actually make a huge setback in terms of constitutional law, in terms of legal environment that we have created equal for all taxpayers. Well, it seems that multinationals and international sports organizations do not consider themselves regular taxpayers. The process that I'm researching on, the bidding process and then the process of legislative interventions for major sports events, proves that they actually treat themselves not only as partners for host countries, but that sports organizations actually feel that they can impose and require legislative changes in host countries. So it's not even a kind of a partnership, it's and negotiation. It's just a requirement. It's just our way or no way. You take the idea that we have in terms of the legal framework for the games or not. And countries agree to that. Not only countries like Qatar or Russia, but also countries like Canada and the UK, where the democracy is well grounded, where it's very transparent how the laws are created. Still, there are legislative changes and they apply specifically to one sporting event, which of course creates questions of discrimination. But from my perspective, it also, as I said, creates questions of disintegration of the system, which is built to achieve certain level of coherence, and then suddenly there's a sporting event and the system is just changed and actually suspended. There's a tax bubble created. There are special laws regarding the IP protection just for the event, for the event, and they're absolutely not analyzed after the event is over because they expire. They they no longer apply, and actually the issue is closed. So I'm interested in your opinion, whether you think it's good and we actually have outdated laws that sports organizations try to improve, or is it just that they feel that they are above the law? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. Your presentation shows us there are much more things participate on this discussion, like sovereignty, moral aspects, and the constructions of laws is much more than a national consideration. And we think the Olympic values is universal values. I think sometimes people think the law is the same, universal law. There's no possible. Okay, now I'd like to ask to call Karolina Ribeiro from Brazil. She is senior specialist in sports policy in Chamber of Deputies National Congress in Brazil.
Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about some of the impacts of the 2014 World Cup on Brazilian federal law. And as I do that, we'll have some examples of what Professor Karolina talked about. Brazil has been a federal republic for 123 years, and at that time the country has been governed by a variety of political systems and 6 constitutions. We are an emergent democracy, a heterogeneous society in which modern currents continue to struggle against a deep-rooted, clientelistic patrimonial tradition. In this light, Brazil's selection to host and organize large-scale sporting events such as the Olympic Games and the World Cup has come to represent a significant learning experience for a young democracy in various ways, specifically with respect to defining the limits of public participation in the organization of the event, respect for the principle of non-interference in the dependence of the 3 spheres of deliberation to enact legislation, public spending oversight and accountability, and lastly, people's participation through an engaged news media, organized civil society entities, and popular movements. The country's historical context and political experiences had a significant impact on the development of and drafting of the rules and regulations the legislative branch was called on to consider and approve as part of the preparation for the World Cup. And as we move through this presentation on the respective legislative changes, we'll better understand some of the impacts of this event's organization in our society while identifying some possible legislative and political legacies. Before we move on to the federal laws approved for the World Cup, it's important to observe that on June 2007, the President of the Republic, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and his Minister of State signed a letter guaranteeing the fulfillment of 11 government measures required by FIFA as a condition to host the event. And although formally guaranteed by the federal government, some of the specified measures required the approval through formal legislation of the Brazilian Congress, where the government held and still holds a majority. The 11 government guarantees required by FIFA are entry and exit permits, work permits, custom rights and taxes, general tax exemption to FIFA, security and protection, banks and currency exchange, immigration, customs and check-in procedures, protection and use of commercial rights, national anthems and flags, compensation, telecommunication information technology. In all, 7 government guarantees signed by the executive branch required authorization and approval of the legislator. We can now examine the federal laws approved for the World Cup: FIFA tax exemption law, differentiated contracting regime law, and the general law for the World Cup. FIFA tax exemption law provides for federal tax exemptions to FIFA, its commercial partners, and other associated members, whether domiciled in Brazil or not. The grant of tax exemptions to FIFA and its collaborators triggered a reaction from the Office of Attorney General of the Republic, which filed, albeit only recently, we should note, a petition challenging the tax breaks before the Federal Supreme Court, arguing that the statute violates the principle of tax equity, which bars an equal treatment for taxpayers in identical circumstances. For example, FIFA's commercial partners domiciled in Brazil in relation to other Brazilian companies. They also say that the exemption was granted for purposes of benefiting FIFA rather than on behalf of a greater public interest. The matter has not yet been heard. The law also sets a deadline of August 1st, 2016, for the submission of the respective accountability statements on the 2013 Confederations Cup and the 2014 World Cup. In the following year, 2011, the Congress approved the differentiated contracting regime, we call RDC law. The implementation of this new regime is not among the 11 government guarantees imposed by FIFA. It was enacted to boost the efficiency of public contracts for the Olympic and Paralympic Games, the Confederations Cup, and the World Cup. The differentiated contracting regime includes a number of distinguishing features in relation to the regular procurement regime, such as reduced timetables, waiver of the project design as a prerequisite for contracting bids, contracting based on public bids, not sealed bids. There is a huge controversy surrounding the Odyssey. The Brazilian Federal Supreme Court received 2 petitions against it. The first petition was entered by the group of opposition political parties, and the second was brought by the Office of the Attorney General of the Republic. Both filings argue the RDC is unconstitutional, among other issues because of the provision allowing for contracts to be awarded without the submission of a basic engineering design, rendering adoption of an objective selection process more difficult. In spite of all the controversy, we may say the RDC has reopened the debate on implementing necessary reforms to the general procurement regime through implementation of a faster and, in some aspects, more efficient process. Last year, the regime was extended to public education and health facility construction projects, and the new regime may emerge as one of the central legislative legacies of the large-scale events. If positive or not, we are yet to know. Finally, we have the General Law of the World Cup, approved in 2012, which is aimed at meeting 5 of the 11 government guarantees undertaken with FIFA. The bill received by far the greatest media attention of all the related instruments and despite contentious debate in the Chamber of Deputies, primarily due to the unprecedented inclusion of so many concessions to FIFA and some provisions with direct impact on the population and fans. In the slides, then let us take a look at some of the controversial aspects of the law. Ticket prices. The World Cup bill vests FIFA with full authority to set ticket prices without mention of the traditional discounts guaranteed to specific population segments under Brazilian federal and state laws, including students and senior citizens above the age of 60. Add to this the fact that Brazilian fans come into the process with certain expectations regarding the World Cup ticket prices, and the potential for problems is evident. And to be sure, entities representing the interests of fans and students enter the fray to demand affordable prices and the application of state laws on ticket price discounts, further fueling the discussion on the question, the World Cup for whom? This led, following several rounds of negotiations between the bill's commissioner, the Executive Office of the President of the Republic, and FIFA, to the inclusion of a provision in the legislation on ticket prices mandating that at least 300,000 affordable tickets be available to Brazilian residents, with a special priority given to students, individuals 60 years or older, and recipients of federal income program transfers. Another controversial matter was the sale and consumption of alcoholic beverages at event venues. In Brazil, the individual states regulate the consumption and sale of alcoholic beverage sporting events. The 5 states with the country's leading football rivalries prohibit the consumption and sale of alcoholic beverages. Each of these will host matches at the 2014 World Cup. In view of FIFA's interest in ensuring the consumption of sponsored products at official event venues, the Federal Bills Commissioner decided to introduce a provision in the World Cup bill expressly authorizing the sale and consumption of alcoholic beverages in all host cities. This sparked intense opposition within the Chamber of Deputies among a number of groups concerned with the link between stadium violence and alcohol, with the support of the Evangelical Caucus. Ultimately, the express authorization was removed on the grounds that individual states have exclusive power to legislate on this matter. As the World Cup bill made its way through the chamber, some deputies expressed a concern with including clauses guaranteeing that a portion of the revenues from the World Cup be donated to direct infrastructure investments in the country, for example, training centers for youth football programs. Unfortunately, it was too late to take up the matter. This particular type of provision would have had to be part of the original negotiations on Brazil's candidacy. As such, there are no provisions for the Brazilian government to receive any portion of the profits or earnings accrued by FIFA or the local organizing committee, which is composed of representatives of the Brazilian Football Confederation. As a result of the debate, a provision was entered in the bill mandating that the government endeavor measures to conclude agreements with FIFA on voluntary investments of World Cup revenues in specific activities to promote sport in Brazil. This clause does not constitute a binding provision, but merely a recommendation. Another important issue is the conflict with Brazilian Consumer Protection Code. The General Law of the World Cup ensures FIFA the freedom to make decisions on a variety of aspects in connection with ticket sales, which are already regulated by the Federal Consumer Protection Code. Consumer rights advocates expressed vehement opposition at public hearings convened by the Chamber of Deputies to the World Cup bill's manifest violation of enshrined consumer rights. Because none of the incentives granted to FIFA violate established constitutional rights, both houses of Congress chose not to amend the text in question. As such, a number of rights assured to Brazilian consumers will not be fulfilled in the World Cup. Civil liability. The World Cup bill also provides that the Union undertake liability for the effects of civil damages from any security event or incident related to the events, except where FIFA or the victim is liable for the event or incident. This norm triggered widespread debate and legal challenges. The Office of the Attorney General of the Republic filed a petition challenging the measure, arguing that it imposes a constitutional duty to provide compensation for events and incidents not related to government activities. The difficulties faced by state law enforcement agency at the year's Confederations Cup to contain acts of violence offer a good example of this type of risk. As we could see, we may have a legislative legacy, and to be sure, a political legacy as well. The differentiated program regime may be the start point for changes in the long and complex regular public contracting regime. In relation to the political legacy, we hope that the large-scale sporting events we are set to host leave us a legacy of empowerment in our political and democratic institutions. And yes, I think we are on the way to building this legacy. People made their voice heard inside and outside the Congress, in the public hearings on the General Law of the World Cup bill debate, and this year in the streets. Some may say it's not enough. I say they were important steps forward. Although people's demands were wide-ranging, it was not a coincidence, as Jens also mentioned at the opening of this conference, that they raised during the Confederations Cup hosted by our country. Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you, Karolina. Your presentation showed the long distance that existed from conquer the mega event and realize it. And in this case of Brazil, we will know about the soap opera after next August. Okay. Next is Ryan Gauthier. Yes? Thank you. PhD candidate in Erasmus University Rotterdam, International and European Law, Netherlands. Thank you.
Perfect. I can wander. Okay, so we're going to try to use Prezi, and hopefully this works and there's no technical complications, but with new technology, there always comes new risks. As was mentioned, my name is Ryan Gauthier. I'm a Canadian, but I'm currently studying my PhD at Erasmus University Rotterdam in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. I'm going to be moving away from legislation. I'm glad I have, because everybody has spoken on legislation much more ably than I could have. And I'm going to take things from a human rights perspective, but also sort of a legal perspective. I am a lawyer by training, but I'm going to be looking at labor rights concerns. I want to talk briefly about three things. I want to talk about the occurrence of forced labor at sports mega events, about the accountability of international sporting organizations for the use of forced labor, and also at hints for some possible steps forward. Fantastic, it works. You never know. So with the forced labor at sports mega events, many of you have probably heard about the Guardian's revelation of forced labor going on in Qatar. Now, they say it's on World Cup projects, but World Cup construction hasn't really fully gotten underway yet, so it's a little bit disingenuous. But the fact that forced labor happens in Qatar is certainly no secret. If you're interested in learning more, Human Rights Watch put out an excellent report last year on both Qatar and Sochi, and I recommend you read both of them. But it is certainly going on. But of course, I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to think like a lawyer and define what forced labor is. Interesting historical note about the ILO Forced Labor Convention. When it was created in the late 1920s, as you see, it was signed in 1930, it was passed amid a concern that colonial governments were using forced labor for construction of public works. 83 years later, we see forced labor being used for public works, not by colonial governments, but by national governments, but also by private contractors. So in one sense, the more things change, the more things stay the same. I'm not going to read the definition. I assume you can read. But there are two key components of the definition. The first is, if you want to see if there's forced labor, you need to look at a menace of penalty. And we see this going on in both Russia and Qatar. There are threats of denunciation of workers to immigration authorities. Given that an estimated 17,500 workers that are working on the Sochi Games are migrant workers from Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, the other stands. That's something, though. You know, if you talk back to your boss and they say, we're going to turn you into the immigration authorities, where you'll probably not just be deported, but also probably thrown in jail for a while, that's problematic. Well, what makes this problematic is that identity documents are often withheld as well. Passports are held by the employer. Work visas are held by the employer. They're not in your personal possession. I left my passport actually in my room, but I would have brought it out here to say, my employer, even though I'm working as a migrant worker essentially in the Netherlands, I still have my passport. This doesn't happen at a lot of these construction sites. And finally, debt bondage. You don't get these jobs by putting your name on a form, sending it in, or signing up online. What happens with a lot of these individuals is they go through brokers. Again, a lot of these individuals come from the stands. In Qatar, a lot of them come from Nepal. They don't just go online and sign up to do this. Usually they have a family member or someone from the village who says, I will get you from Nepal to Qatar, but you need to pay me in advance. You need to give me some money so I can transport you, so I can arrange your work visa, so I can get you the job, but now you're in debt. So even if you want to leave your work, now you have loan sharks after you. So these are the penalties. These are just some of the penalties that these workers are facing. And then there's the involuntariness aspect of it. The menace of penalty usually hints at that it's involuntary, that you're coerced. But there's also deception. Did these people know they are going to be working 12-hour days with one day off every few weeks? Did they know their wages would be withheld? Last week you may have heard of a hunger strike it was actually a Russian worker in Sochi who went on a hunger strike. He sewed his mouth shut because he hadn't been paid in 2 months. Within a few hours, he was arrested. I haven't heard what happened to him since. If anyone knows, I would be interested in that. But that certainly happens. And also working in extreme climatic conditions. You may have heard from the Guardian report that more than one Nepali per day died in Qatar. And it's not that these are 65-year-old men working under extreme conditions. They're in their late 20s, early 30s, and they're dying because they're working in 45-degree heat without any water or breaks. So again, if they had known this, would they have taken the job? Maybe, maybe not. I'm going to assume probably not. And this matters not just for Russia and Qatar, but also for future mega event hosts. As these mega events move to the BRICS, as they move to other hosts such as Qatar, possibly Argentina, although I admit I know almost nothing about Argentina, but these countries tend to have a rather poor human rights record, and they suffer from a lack of democratic deficits. And on the other hand, though, we can't simply say, as was suggested earlier, well, how about we just, put human rights in as a condition? If you don't meet human rights, you can't host the games. We can just ban these countries from hosting because we're going to run out of countries really quick to host the games. You couldn't host them in Canada because they treat the natives badly. You couldn't host them in the US because of Guantanamo, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not just a matter of banning, it's a matter of amelioration. And it's a matter of figuring out who's accountable. And really, the question is, who is accountable for these conditions, for the Nepalese working in 45-degree weather? Well, there are some obvious actors. The contractors, the folks who hire the workers obviously should be accountable because they're the ones who engage in the practices. Of course, it's always hard to hold the contractors liable. Will a Russian court convict a Russian contractor for breaking Russian law when it's employing Uzbeks? I don't know, but I'm guessing the answer is a guarded maybe. Same thing with Qatar. Would they necessarily hold them accountable? I don't know. They say yes, but it still seems to be going on. I hope they do, but it seems a guarded maybe at this point. Also, the organizing committees of these events. These committees are usually staffed by high-up political people, the mayors, vice prime ministers, etc. It's hard to hold them accountable, as well as the host state. Can you hold the host state accountable? In the case of Russia, perhaps you could take them to the European Court of Human Rights. It'll probably take about 7 years, but you could do it. Sure, for what little it matters. But again, could you take, say, Qatar to a court? Probably not. So that leaves us with international sports organizations. I'm not saying that these other bodies should not be held accountable or they cannot be held accountable, but there are serious questions with these actors. So now the hard actor, the international sports organizations, FIFA, the IOC, etc. And they should be held accountable. And not because they should care about human rights. That argument's been tried, that argument hasn't worked well. Everyone says that, it doesn't go anywhere. I'm going to advance 3 brief arguments that I think are a little bit more persuasive. And the first is a very lawyery argument, which translates roughly as proximate cause, but I like to use the phrase but for. But for awarding the Olympic Games to Russia, there are not 70,000 workers in Sochi. But for awarding the games to Qatar, there are not stadiums being built. This is a little different than, say, the homosexual laws in Russia. Those aren't connected to the games. The games play a part in that, but they're not because of the games. But labor on stadiums is because of the games. So because they cause that, they should do something about it. Secondly, the internal values of the Olympics. And again, you can talk about the Olympic Charter and human dignity, et cetera, et cetera. But the Olympic Games, the IOC in particular, has actually said, as a 2011 document, that we will address forced labor. And they haven't. They have failed to abide by their own internal documents and values. That's problematic. Third, legacy. We heard talk about legal legacy earlier, and I absolutely believe that is something that should be considered, and sadly isn't. Employment, one of the legacies of the Olympic Games and other sporting events that these organizations like to talk about is all the construction and all the money that'll go in, particularly in times of a recession. You have these events that have to go on, you have these stadiums that have to be built, so you'll find workers for them. They don't get put off like other projects in a recession. This was Spain's argument for wanting Madrid to host the 2020 Games. They said this would be perfect. And the idea is that you'll have people trained, you'll have people paid, you'll have people with more skills as a result of these events. But if you're hiring migrant workers and then having them subjected to conditions of forced labor, well, that's not a positive legacy. That's a negative legacy for reasons I hope I don't really have to go into. But you aren't training anybody, you're just ingraining bad employment practices. It's really, really awful. And it violates what these organizations say that they'll do. So again, this is just a really brief overview to give you an idea on it. There's a lot more details to be had here, but I just want you to have a brief idea. So moving forward, there aren't any concrete exact solutions. But as I've shown, there are sort of 2 major problems. There's the immediate problem using forced labor, and then there's a larger problem of general accountability, which is sort of the theme of the conference, if I can give it a theme, if I can be so bold. And there are solutions to the forced labor problem. There are some immediate ones, but obviously those aren't really working. But certainly one thing that comes out of examining the host selection process is that labor laws aren't addressed at all. This is strange, considering that there's $200 billion estimated to be spent on the World Cup in Qatar, and the Sochi Winter Olympic Games cost around $25 billion, depending on what estimate you make. And to give a large construction project like that and then not ask about labor conditions seems really strange, at least to me. I mean, I'm a labor lawyer by background, so I'm biased, But to me, that seems really odd. And the only labor law conditions that are addressed are for the media, and I've seen one bidder say, we will address labor laws, we'll add a no strike provision, so we don't have what happened in Brazil with the strikes. And that was France, and they said, we'll make no strike provisions, which isn't really progressive as far as labor law goes. And host selection criteria do have a norm generating effect. Countries seem to listen to these laws or requirements from the international sporting organizations. I have examples about that. I'm happy to talk about them afterwards, but I'll skip them over right now for brevity. And then there's the accountability problem. Who do we hold liable? Who do we hold accountable? And again, as a lawyer, the first thing I think of is, who can I sue? Who can I take to court? Well, again, there's lots of problems with all of these actors. The IOC has been taken to court. The Vancouver Olympic Organizing Committee, for instance, was taken to court. And courts don't like to extend their jurisdiction over these international sporting bodies. They can. There's no prevention of suit against these guys. There's no immunity, but the courts don't like to do that. So we need to start thinking about creating our own accountability mechanisms, trying something new. What about creating an ombudsman for these victims of forced labor to go appeal to? Or what about creating a monitoring body for sports mega events? For those of you who know anything about the world of finance, certainly I don't, but the World Bank was deemed to be fairly unaccountable. And about half a decade ago, they created the World Bank Inspection Panel. And the World Bank Inspection Panel was to receive complaints about all of the construction activities going on World Bank funded projects. Can we create something like that for sports mega events? It doesn't have to be just the Olympics generally, it could be sports mega events broadly. Now the question is, how are these executed? I don't know yet. I've just started looking into these problems. Are these even possible? I don't know yet. But we have a very real problem, and these simple solutions aren't working. So maybe we need to start thinking of trying something new to fix both the short-term problem and the long-term problem. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Ryan. It's incredible to think in human rights, worker rights, and volunteer work with institutions that won and saved too much money with our contribution. Okay, let's go. The next one is Gorana Gavrilov from United Kingdom, and she was event manager, is a like freelancer. Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I should just clarify, you'll probably see right through this, I don't speak British English, I speak Canadian English. I was born and raised there, and I moved to the UK a couple of years ago. So I'm working there freelance now. I've been involved in several Olympic events, Commonwealth Games, numerous events, and I have a real strong passion for volunteering, not only for managing volunteers, but also from being a volunteer myself. And although some mega events may see them as free labor, we do need to discuss it in terms of legislation and taking care of workers' rights, because they are workers, they're just not getting paid for it. And we do have to be conscious of that. So, how can you have a successful sporting event? Considering that most large-scale events rely on volunteer workforce, it's important to have happy volunteers, because after all, you do want them to stick around to the end of the event if it's lasting a couple of weeks. So you would need effective recruitment volunteer policy. You have to understand their motivation. Why are they doing this? It's not just for fun. It's not because they're altruistic, they want to help out the community. They have plenty of free time, and they obviously have tons of money that they can go around, working for free. You really do have to understand what has motivated them to take part in that particular event, and you need to manage their expectations. Well, how can you manage their expectations if you don't know what they're expecting? So I think there really does need to be a thorough recruitment process, and all of these issues need to be taken into consideration when you are bringing on board several thousand volunteers for these mega events. Now, in terms of London 2012, you had 250,000 applications. Okay, 250,000 people wanted to give up their time. You had around about 100,000 interviews for 70,000 games maker positions. Now, I should clarify that games makers were people who were involved in the test events, in the Olympic, the games time roles, as well as the Paralympics. And to clarify, for those of you who are not familiar, the test event started in May 2011 and finished in June 2012, just before the games happened. And it was a ways to test the facilities, logistics, organization, and security of the Olympic venues, and also to train some of the staff and volunteers. They obviously did not need all of them. They needed about 10,000 for the test events. So what I did was an independent study last year. Once a thorough literature review was conducted, previous studies and motivational theories were used to create a theoretical framework. I conducted 229 questionnaires, 7 full-length interviews, some of them lasting, gosh, about an hour and a half. These volunteers really had a lot to talk about. And like I said, it was 10,000 test event volunteers that were involved, so this ended up being about 2% of the population. Now, I focused on the test event volunteers because I really wanted a local representation. I could have interviewed Olympic or Games time volunteers, but in that instance, you would have had a lot of international people. Now, I wanted to do this so that way this data could be applicable to other festivals or sporting events, maybe that aren't on such a large scale, and you would understand why people would be involved. So, altruism. We think a lot of people will want to give up their time because they want to help out a cause. Well, that's definitely true when it comes to charities or possibly a local event or a museum that they wanted to help out with. But if you take a look at previous studies, it's definitely on sporting events and festivals, they tend to have more career-focused goals or social motivation. And it is important to remember, that volunteers are a core component of mega events and Olympics culture. Now, quickly taking a look at the findings, because I really could spend all day telling you about this. The average test event volunteer was male between the ages of 51 and 64, employed full-time, lived in Southeast England, previously volunteered, but never at a sports event, and will volunteer at the Summer Games of 2012. It was not obligatory for people to be available for all 3 events, so the test events, the Olympics and the Paralympics. They could select 1, 2, or 3 out of 3, and then it was up to the LOCOG recruitment as to who they called to help out for which event. So just over 3/4 of volunteers had volunteered taking part in the past, but less than half at a sports event. So this was something new for many of them. And volunteers tend to feel a sense of achievement when they volunteer, but interestingly enough, they do not expect any type of recognition. So all of these little pin badges and little gifts that they were getting, they said, okay, well, that was nice. I wasn't expecting it. It wasn't necessary. It was okay. But they were expecting something else, which I'll come to in just a moment. Now, motivation. What motivated them? Overwhelmingly, it was Olympic-related. It was a chance of a lifetime. And altruistic reasons, obviously minimal, but those who did select that in the questionnaire were generally from the older age bracket. And just to go to a few details based on gender and demographics, males were involved because they were involved in sport. Females were motivated because of national pride, and the younger age bracket to gain new skills and experience and to improve their chances of employment. So if we know this, why wouldn't we create opportunities or at least train them or enable them to gain something from the experience? Like I said, it's not free labor, and we can't think of it that way. So if they're expecting these things, they're motivated to take part in these events because that's what they expect. Well, why wouldn't we provide that? And this was also supported by the interviews which I conducted. For example, to be a doctor at the Olympics was probably the best thing I could have put on my CV. So it was somebody who was going through medical school, and she was a field of play doctor. So of course it's very impressive on a CV. Now, to go into detail about volunteering and career, it was definitely most important for the 18 to 24-year-olds as well as the students. Just over 3/4 of them believed that the games maker experience would improve their employability. And those who did not agree were obviously from the older age brackets, because if you had 25 years of work experience, why would you need to volunteer to get more work? Some of this is quite obvious, but when you do conduct research, it does come out, it's very concrete. Now, not one respondent disagreed with the statement, volunteering strengthens one's CV. So they obviously do see a benefit to it, and almost all of them seeing volunteering as a beneficial way to gain new skills. So having someone stand at an entrance to a lift, monitoring it for 6 hours to make sure no one goes in, is not really using skills. To do that for a few hours, rotate them to another position where they can gain some skills, that's fine, that's acceptable. But having that person stand there 3 shifts in a row, like 3 days in a row, is not acceptable in my mind. And I don't think, and to be quite honest, I think organizers, managerial staff, they really need to be aware of this, and they have to create these opportunities, or at least create that rotation where it is a positive experience for everyone. Now, expectations, although the main focus of the study was on motivation, expectations emerged to be important through the interviews because we could discuss this. And what did they expect? Well, some anticipated problems. It's a practice run. It's like the dance recital, the dress rehearsal before the big performance, whereas others expected a highly organized, smooth-running event. It's the Olympics, after all. They've done a few of them, so they should know what they're doing by now. But if you just want to take a quick read over this, you can see that if employees or volunteers are not motivated, they'll become disenchanted, they'll be demotivated, they won't be showing up for their shifts. You want these people really to stay there for the duration of the event, whether it be a week or 10 days or 2 weeks. And will they return for their next shift? Although 85% stated that their expectations thus far when they did the questionnaires had been met, some were demotivated. They didn't feel valued. This came out through the interviews. And there were attrition rates that were talked about by some of the interviewees. So 4 out of the 7 talked about how they had no-shows as the test event proceeded. This was due to unfulfilled expectations, lost motivations. There were also some poor working conditions. People were standing outdoors. We were in London. It was raining a lot. These test events were happening in the spring. So how can you make sure that these people want to come back? They didn't expect to be standing outdoors. And what was really interesting is in the interview, so the gentleman said he was seriously thinking of pulling out, but the interview session was almost like a therapy session. So these volunteers were complaining about all this, and it should have been like this, and I can't believe that. But at the end of it, they were like, you know what? I would do it again. I would do it again. I loved all the positive stuff that came out of it. And we're talking just at the test events. So this isn't the big glitz and glamour of the Olympic Games and all the international guests coming and the major events that people were coming to watch, let's say the athletics. But they did find it an interesting experience, and they learned, for those who didn't work at a sports event, they learned about these sports. So watching being in the hockey stadium and watching some of these games, they were like, oh, well, this is really cool. Never really knew about this game. I only knew about ice hockey, but hey, I wouldn't mind taking part in this or attending some of the events. So it did create something almost like a desire in them to explore sporting events, whether it was as a spectator or to volunteer further. Now, quickly, in practice, obviously understanding the motivation, managing their expectations, and providing an enjoyable volunteer experience will result in lower attrition rate, will also be a better experience for the volunteers, and also, I think, for the organizers, because if you have happy workers, happy volunteers, you'll have a better managed event. You could create a legacy, and I know London aimed to do that. I'll get to my issues with that in just a minute. And obviously, the continuance of volunteering, you want these people to go out and help their communities. And I believe that why shouldn't you take this a step further as an organizing committee or as managerial staff and create suitable roles and training specific to demographics? So for example, skills development and training for the younger volunteers and students, more challenging or interesting roles for the 35 to 50-year-olds, or let's say a supervisory level, which with LOCOG, it was paid staff that were doing this, and more social roles for those nearing retirement. Now, I should clarify that this was an independent study. I didn't want LOCOG involved in this. I wanted to, because they actually did come out and tell all of the volunteers that you shouldn't be talking to anyone, specifically the media, about what's going on and keep everything secret. And even while I was handing out the questionnaires and talking to them, I had people run away from me saying, I can't talk to you. You're the media, I can't talk to you. I'm like, no, I'm actually just doing a survey. So I really did want the honest opinion from these volunteers. I did manage a team of volunteers in the Athletes Village in the Guest Pass Center. So it was people who were coming in on a day pass. They were friends and family of the athletes or of the National Olympic Committees. And so I did have a large group of volunteers. And although none of them participated in this study because the study was finished before the games, I used my experience, what I learned about this, through conversation and through observation. I took on board what some of these volunteers wanted and expected, and I was very aware of situations. So I think that's very key. And for example, there was a gentleman who is not interested. There was a gentleman who was not interested in computers. I mean, I could see him taking, 2 steps back every time he was rotated into that role, but he loved the conflict management. So I put him in a role where he would deal with some of the difficult people trying to enter the village who were obviously not given permission to do that. There was also a lady who's a homemaker for most of her life. She decided she really wanted to learn about computers. It didn't matter what she was doing. She's like, I can be here and I can learn. I'll never use this program again, but I can type. And she said it was a great learning opportunity and a job from which you could not get fired. Okay? We don't fire volunteers, but why not encourage them to learn new things if that's what they want to do? This man doesn't want to work on the computer. Put him in the situation where he can work, and just being aware. And I think that's what we need to do as managers. And in terms of legacy, there's no website, there's no online database set up, which I think is a real shame. I know London really wanted to create a legacy of volunteering in that. There was a Be Inspired newsletter that came out in March, inviting all the volunteers to come to an event at the Olympic Park in June. And I quote here, "With the Olympic Games still fresh in the mind, join Team London, take advantage of this unprecedented opportunity," and it's really to celebrate the opening in the park a year later. But still fresh in the mind, well, this is a year later, okay? Still fresh in the mind. I'm thinking October 2012, a month after the games have finished, when people have this void in their life and they don't know what to do because they've been volunteering for several months, and they want to do something. Well, I think it's a little bit too little too late. And I think it would be ideal, and I have spoken with people who work for London and Partners and who are also in LOCOG, why this hasn't been set up. And it's just, well, privacy rights, and we can send out this newsletter, but the newsletter has very little information in terms of volunteering. It's more promoting cultural and sporting events, and that was it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And now we can promote some discussion. And if you want to make questions to the participants. Okay.
It's for Karolina, but the one from Warsaw. If you know when the law obligation started, when they start changing the law of the countries that hosted, if there was since the beginning or if there was a date that turned on?
Yeah, that's an extremely interesting question because it also kind of allows us to ask whether the legacy is for the host countries or for the Olympic Committee and other sports organizations. And the thing is that the legislative interventions started as a result of an experience of international sports organizations with failures that they had with protecting their interests. And the first situation that I recognized was the the Atlanta Olympic Games in 1996. And then Sydney 2000 was actually the first modern host city contract that required the host to change laws. Because Sydney was the first case in history where athletes were actually taxed. The next Olympic Games already had special provisions in the host city contracts to ensure that such situation wouldn't happen. So basically, it's really a very recent topic, a very recent issue for international sports organizations and host countries, and it's actually been a decade of legislative changes.
So if I could add one more thing to that,
Yeah.
that's okay. Yeah, if I remember right, the first host city contract, I want to say it was Montreal, but I think I might be wrong. I think it was Moscow. Moscow and Lake Placid would have been, I think those were the first sort of real host city contracts. But you take a look at those contracts, and you can get them from the IOC. They're out of embargo now, and they're only like 3 pages long, if that. But really, after Los Angeles, given the boycotts from Russia, you start to see guarantees now about delivery of the games and about what happens if they have to remove the games. So if there's a boycott, condition of war, et cetera. So you start to see this really popping up formally post-Moscow. Again, as far as like tactically, was it really specific? No, it was very general, but you saw the Olympics really trying to start to protect things post-Moscow, post-Los Angeles, really 1980s phenomenon, I would think.
Next.
My name is Liz Martin, and I'm with Brazil Police Watch, and my question is for Ryan. This morning we heard Walter Gregorio essentially wash FIFA's hands of any responsibility around anything having to do with human rights or morality. And I'm wondering now, Human Rights Watch has a petition to the IOC about homophobic practices. And what are your thoughts about realistic change around human rights and these two organizations?
Realistic change, I wouldn't be very hopeful unless, as someone mentioned earlier this morning, you really get the sponsors on board and the sponsors engaged. I mean, why would the IOC listen to Human Rights Watch or anyone else? Now, I'm not saying that they wouldn't. I'm not saying that's impossible. I'm sure there's particular IOC members, some that I know, who are very much appalled at what's going on. But again, how you activate them and how you do that, that's not a particular question I have an answer to. I would like to think that there is some way, but I think that's why we need to start thinking outside the box and getting these organizations engaged more. I mean, petitions are all fine and well, but I'm not sure of, I think they're a good thing, but I'm not sure if they're actual practical value. I don't mean to sort of rain on that parade.
Eduardo again, sorry. Just to clarify the first question, was it the Olympic Committee that started with the law requirements, or the FIFA just followed? Do you know, have any data regarding that?
Yeah, from my experience, it was the International Olympic Committee. I also use my time to clarify the huge time difference between what I said and what Ryan has said. I'm a tax lawyer, and what I said basically applies to tax issues in the legal framework of the games. And from my experience, it was the IOC that was actually the pioneer and still is. Although UEFA was the first to make very strict policies about taxation, because it was actually UEFA that was the first to say, we're actually going to treat it as a precondition for hosting the event to guarantee that no taxes will be paid.
I would like to ask Karolina from Brazil. In the specific case of, in the Brazilian case, you show it how the laws were need to change to these events in Brazil. But there is a complex system to approve a law in Brazil, and what happens now to the laws are approved, and who is the society in this situation? Could you talk about that?
Well,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. When it's curious because when President Lula signed the letter, he promised to fulfill those government, but some of the requirements needed approval of the legislator. But he had the majority of the legislative branch. So we had some discussions in the parliament, a lot of discussions in the general law of the World Cup, but he had the majority, and the bill was introduced to the parliament in 2011. He had too little time to approve it. So I think that discussions were kind of, how to say prejudicadas. We had little time to discuss it, and people had little time also to deliver their demands. Mm-hmm. And I think that with the few time we had, we managed to change some things. But I think that the executive power should have introduced the bill earlier. It would be much more different than it was. That's it.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. The question, Kim, and after you.
Hi, thank you. Kim Schimmel from Kent State University. I wanted to also ask to throw in another aspect of the law that probably will come up tomorrow, but to see if the panelists had any insight into this particular aspect of the law, which has to do with military protection of Olympic teams. So, for example, after was originally a part of the IOC charter, and part of the contract that host nations would provide protection for the Olympic Games, essentially, and for all teams. After 1972, Israel got basically an exemption that said they were allowed to bring armed guards to Olympics to protect their own teams. So that was the situation for a while, until after the terrorist attacks in the United States in 2001. In 2004, when the Summer Games were in Greece, a part of the Greek constitution states that no foreigner, nobody who's not a Greek citizen can own a handgun on Greek soil. The IOC charter says that host nations will be the only ones that provide protection for teams. The United States said, if we don't bring our own guns and our own army, we're not coming. And the United States still continues to do that. So the United States and Israel are the ones that send armed guards for their own teams, sometimes now through NATO, which probably the United States orders to do at its bidding as well. So I guess the thing that I find interesting is, in some cases, there's event-specific legislation where constitutions and countries change their laws. In this case, and I think it will continue, in this case, local laws and local even state constitutions are ignored, right? We'll certainly see the case in Brazil where private defense contractors and others will be either in violation of charter or of Brazilian law. So, sorry, this is like a long thing, but so I guess in looking at these bids and looking at these contracts, that is, have you noticed anything explicit about who will provide military protection, whether or not local constitutions will be honored? You have more insight into those specifics than I do.
None of the 11 government measures required by FIFA is related to this. We have not talked about this in none of the legislation, federal legislation. Maybe they are making some negotiations. We are federal, like our FBI, okay? We call our federal police with the Minister of Justice, but no legislation, no formal legislation was needed.
It is worth noting that we actually are kind of worse than our ancient colleagues, because the ancient Olympics had something called Olympic truce. And it basically meant that no armies were allowed to the Olympia for the duration of the games, and it was absolutely forbidden to attack athletes and their families traveling to Olympia. Well, where are we now? Why can't we agree on something like that internationally?
Yeah, my name's Marcus Hoy. I work for Play the Game. Can Karolina Ribeiro tell us a little bit more about the exemption from civil liability in case of accidents? Did that get implemented? And also, will FIFA be immune in all circumstances regarding consumer protection, for example, ticket sales?
Could you repeat the action referring to the ticket sales, please?
Yeah, I'm wondering if FIFA will be immune from all consumer protection law in relation to, example, ticket sales and other official merchandise that's purchased, that kind of thing.
FIFA, the general law of the World Cup, provides for general tax exemption to FIFA, including the ticket sales.
Consumer protection exemptions. Civil exemptions.
Consumo. Como assim de consumo? Eu não entendi a pergunta dele.
Maybe I'll give a
sentido
comment
de
to your
garantir-
question as regards UEFA Euro 2012 that we held in Poland, because I asked you a question whether the legacy is actually for international sports organizations or for host countries. And the thing with consumer protection as regards tickets is actually very interesting, because international sports organizations learned from each other and from their experiences with major sports event in different countries. And we had a consumer protection issue in Poland, because UEFA put some clauses in the contracts regarding tickets that are actually forbidden under Polish law. The funny thing is that, of course, everything is ruled by Swiss law as regards the games and also ticket sales and stuff. And what happened then was that the General Consumer Protection Agency in Poland questioned the forbidden clauses and asked UEFA specifically to get rid of them because they were forbidden under Polish law. The case is actually still going because the agency took UEFA to the court. UEFA was absolutely mad about it because it was a precedent, and of course it immediately landed in all future host city contracts, and I'm sure FIFA knows about it, and I'm sure FIFA kind of secured this situation in their own contracts.
Just in one statement, what was the issue at stake with the ticket?
I don't remember specifically, but from what I know, it referred to handicapped persons. There is some consumer protection law in Poland saying that when someone purchases a ticket and uses a wheelchair, for example, then has some special rights or protection, and UEFA just ignored those Polish laws.
I think the same is happening in Brazil now, and in the last Confederations Cup, there is problem when the tickets were buying, and now there is a discussion who will pay to this situation, because if the Brazilian government or if is a FIFA problem.
It's not solved yet.
And that it's not solved yet because there is no part of the
Yes.
contract.
Okay.
Any question? Oh, yes.
I have a question for our volunteer expert. Unfortunately, she got stuck on a panel full of lawyers.
But there was someone missing, and I think that person would have been more.
Yeah, so I have a question about volunteers, though. I have a few friends who volunteer with the Olympic Games, and their plan is to essentially be a permanent volunteer, going from place to place to place. And I know you said only test events, but do you think, just off the top of your head, what you have said about what these volunteers need and what they want, does that change as we start to see this cadre of 70 permanent volunteers move from Olympic Games to Olympic Games to Olympic Games?
It's happened. I know there are volunteers within my area. Actually, I should just take a step back and clarify that although I interviewed the test event volunteers, I think it was 96% of them were going to go on and volunteer for the Olympic Games. So I'm considering them all games makers, but I wanted a local focus. That's why I chose to interview them. Now, I know there were a couple of volunteers in my group that were like, yeah, we're going to go and volunteer at Sochi. And we did have someone from the Sochi organizing committee who was in charge of the athletes village over there, and he was in London sort of doing some training and seeing how it was all happening. And he was definitely handing out business cards, and he said, listen, if you need help or if you wanted some more information, contact me. But 2 NOC assistants, so they were helping out with the National Olympic Committees, I actually had dinner with them a couple of weeks ago. They're going to Sochi early next year to help out with the games. And it's quite a normal phenomenon for people to jump from Olympics to Olympics. We're talking a commitment of 2 weeks, plus, a couple of weeks training beforehand, flights and staying later, maybe a week. So 5, maximum 6 weeks commitment once every 2 years if you want to do winter to summer back to back, or once every 4 years if you want to just focus on one type of event. But it is normal and it is doable. I know for the Sochi Games, they require that all volunteers at least speak some basic Russian. And on the other hand, they also require all Russians involved to speak some basic English, because when you have radio communication, you really do need that, or people coming up to you. So it does happen.
But do these people have different expectations, or do they expect the skills training that perhaps they get, or do they see it as, you know what, this is a 6-week vacation, I have to do 40 hours of volunteering at the games, and I don't care if I watch an elevator for 10 hours a day, I still get to go to Sochi, Pyeongchang, whatever.
For them, it's actually a combination. So one, first and foremost, it's an amazing experience, international travel, and it is the excitement of the event. It's the Olympic experience. So that's definitely in the forefront. And then, yes, picking up new skills, picking up a new language, dealing with people in other, from other cultures in other continents. Those are also learning skills. But no, they're not in there to pick something up. But that's why I did focus on sort of these local ones that were, UK based, Southeast England, that did want to pick up the skills, and that's why. But yes, if I did a study that was only focused on the Olympic volunteers, and I would have had definitely more numbers in terms of international people, and they'd be looking at different things.
Okay. Any question? Yes.
Thank you. At first, I'm sorry for my English. I come from Russia. I work in the state channel TV. Russian TV called RTR. It is the biggest channel. I want only say that Olympic Games start. Maybe you don't know, but Olympic fire run in every big Russian town now. And many people can part in this beautiful show for us. For example, when I come to Denmark from St. Petersburg, 27th of October, Olympic fire come to St. Petersburg and run in the street. Now when I come back to Russia, to my town Arkhangelsk, it is big port in the near White Sea, Olympic fire come to my town too. And I want to say that the Olympic fire was in Arctic region too, and many people use in this too. So Russian people start Olympic Games now, only it. Thank you.
Yep. Well, thank you very much for your presentation and for our audience. And I think we want to discuss much more about loss and legacy. And as a Brazilian person, I'm really, really worried with this discussion, yes. Because when we want a party, we don't think in the consequences of what happens to promote the party. So we have time until the next play the game. We know more about that. Thank you very much.